The 1950s. World War II has recently ended. The sitting president was Harry S. Truman, most remembered for his decision to use the atomic bomb against the Japanese, resulting in Japan's surrender at the end of the war in 1945. Here are a few things that defined the decade. Families of the 50s were portrayed as joyful and content. However, people were also afraid of nuclear warfare. Traditional gender roles were reaffirmed. People began moving to the suburbs. Conformity was common, segregation and protests began, and there was a real post-World War II economic boom. Immigration. In the midst of Cold War hysteria, Congress passed the Immigration and Nationality Act and the Subversive Activities Control Act in 1952. These were the two most controversial bills regarding immigration restrictionism in the United States. The Subversive Activities Control Act established a board to investigate persons suspected of engaging in subversive activities. The Immigration and Nationality Act reinforced the controversial system of immigrant sectionalism established by the Immigration Act of 1924. It reformed some of the obvious discriminatory immigration laws. However, Asians remained the only population tracked by race, with their overall immigration capped at 2,000 per year. Migration. There was a huge wave of internal migration as new suburbs prospered and spread across post-war America. Ownership of cars allowed people to commute to and from work so they didn't have to live right in the city. Homes became more affordable and accessible to the working class, and they were perfect for young families. White American identity. A sense of uniformity pervaded American society. Conformity was common, as young and old alike followed group norms rather than striking out on their own. Men and women had been forced into new employment patterns during World War II, but once the war was over, traditional roles were reaffirmed. Men were expected to be the breadwinners, and for women it was assumed that their proper place was at home. These uniform living plans and suburb developments were given names like Fertility Valley. These perfect homes were often not so perfect for the women who lived in them. In fact, the booms of the 1950s had a confining effect on many American women. Advice books and magazine articles urged women to leave the workforce and embrace their roles as wives and mothers. The idea that a woman's most important job was to bear and rear children wasn't a new one, but in the 50s it began to generate a great deal of dissatisfaction among women who yearned for a more fulfilling life. This dissatisfaction, in turn, contributed to the rebirth of the feminist movement in the 1960s. That was the experience for white people, but things were quite different for black people. As all these white families left the cities, they left behind growing poor and minority populations. Schools were desegregated nationwide in 1954. Brown v. Board of Education was a landmark decision of the U.S. Supreme Court, in which the court ruled that U.S. state laws establishing racial segregation in public schools are unconstitutional. The Montgomery bus boycott was a protest against the bus system of Montgomery, Alabama, that began in 1955. It lasted over a year and resulted in the Supreme Court ruling segregation on public buses unconstitutional. Here are a few events relating to geography and environment that occurred in the 1950s. In 1952, a tsunami occurred in Indonesia, so strong that it hit parts of California, Washington, and the Hawaiian Islands. In 1953, there were 3 tornadoes in the U.S. The Flint tornado in Michigan killed 115 people. In Texas, the Waco tornado killed 114 people, and the Worcester tornado, which killed 94 people in Massachusetts. Harry S. Truman was the sitting president as the decade began. He was previously in the Senate before becoming vice president for FDR in 1945. His biggest concern was containing communism. In 1953, Dwight D. Eisenhower became the new president. He was a World War II hero. He was strong and forceful but had a calming presence and brought a sense of stability to the country. At the end of the decade, the U.S. emerged as the strongest military power in the world. Starting in 1953, Joseph McCarthy fueled anti-communist hysteria and led anti-communist hearings accusing innocent Americans of being communists and ruining their careers. Artists, writers, actors, and creative people were especially targeted and their careers were destroyed. At one of these anti-communist hearings, Joseph Welch, a lawyer for the U.S. Army, stood up and said outright, "Have you no sense of decency?" After that, McCarthy lost all his power overnight and died a broken man. In terms of international relations, U.S. involvement in the Korean conflict, which was spurred by our desire to contain communism, began in the summer of 1950 and lasted about 3 years. Halfway through the decade, in November 1955, the Vietnam War began and lasted almost 20 years. However, the U.S. didn't officially get involved until 1964. The 50s was a decade of prosperity, and the economy overall grew by 37%. The post-World War II boom was a broad period of worldwide economic expansion, driven by growing consumer demand. After 6 years of wartime rationing, American consumers were ready to spend money, and as factories made a switch from war to peacetime production, the major corporations in America grew even larger. The advancements in technology in the 1950s were vast. The first kidney transplant was done in 1954. Jukeboxes could be found at almost every diner. Color TV was invented in 1953. Photocopiers went on the market in 1959. And in 1950, the first credit cards, Diners Club cards, were invented and made of cardboard. Society and culture were influenced by many things in the 50s. Film, TV, music, and fashion influenced pop culture and vice versa. There were many celebrities and icons who ruled over pop culture: James Dean, Marilyn Monroe, Cary Grant, and Elvis Presley. Some of the new toys and fads that were all the rage included hula hoops, frisbees, slinkies, Mr. Potato Head, the first Barbie, and many more. At the start of the decade, feel-good films were being released because that was what everyone wanted to see. Roman Holiday, Lady and the Tramp, Singing in the Rain. The emergence of films about rebellion or standing up to the establishment came about towards the end of the decade, On the Waterfront and Rebel Without a Cause. We all know Rosa Parks. On December 1st, 1955, she refused to give up her seat on the bus, which was the seminal event that kicked off the Montgomery bus boycott and the civil rights movement. Black influences. Gwendolyn Brooks was the first African American to receive a Pulitzer Prize and won it in 1950 for her book of poetry, Annie Allen. James Baldwin was an American novelist, playwright, essayist, poet, and activist. His first novel was published in 1953, Go Tell It on the Mountain. It was an autobiographical work about growing up in Harlem. Althea Gibson was an American tennis player and one of the first black athletes to cross the color line of international tennis. She won Wimbledon and the U.S. Nationals, and in 1956, she became the first African American to win a Grand Slam title. Thanks for listening. It was my pleasure to give you this peek into the fabulous 50s.